"Can you hug me?" the little black girl asked. And the crystal ballroom fell so quiet that even the soft notes of the string quartet seemed to disappear into the glittering chandeliers above. Every conversation stopped. Every champagne glass froze halfway to waiting lips. Hundreds of distinguished guests turned toward the tiny voice that had somehow carried farther than the evening's keynote speech. Jonathan Hayes, the 45-year-old billionaire whose name was attached to hospitals, universities, and foundations across America, stood motionless at the center of the grand stage, one hand still resting against the polished podium. He had spent years answering impossible business questions without hesitation, but no quarterly report, no boardroom negotiation, and no television interview had ever prepared him for 7 simple words spoken by a child. The little girl stood near the edge of the ballroom entrance, barely tall enough to see over the marble railing. She wore a faded blue cardigan carefully buttoned despite its loose threads, a pair of well-worn sneakers that had clearly walked many miles, and 2 neat braids tied with bright yellow ribbons that looked lovingly cared for even if everything else she owned had seen better days. Around one wrist rested a small woven bracelet of blue and white yarn, frayed from years of use, but protected as though it were the most valuable thing she possessed. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She simply waited, her warm brown eyes meeting Jonathan's with a calm honesty that unsettled everyone watching. Security exchanged uncertain glances before one guard quietly stepped forward, assuming the child had wandered into the exclusive charity gala by mistake. Before he could say a word, Jonathan lifted one hand without taking his eyes off the girl. The guard stopped immediately. The room remained suspended in silence. Jonathan slowly walked down the wide staircase leading from the stage, his polished dress shoes echoing softly across the marble floor. The distance between them couldn't have been more than 30 feet, yet it felt strangely longer, as though every step carried him farther away from the carefully controlled life he had spent decades building. When he finally reached her, he knelt until they were almost eye level. Up close, he noticed details no camera across the ballroom could capture. Tiny freckles dusted her cheeks. Her sleeves had been folded with remarkable care. One shoelace had been tied twice to keep it from coming undone. She carried herself with quiet dignity that didn't belong to someone so young. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked gently. "Ava," she answered with a small smile. "And yes, sir, I really meant my question." Jonathan searched her face, expecting someone nearby to reveal it was part of the evening's entertainment, a hidden publicity campaign, or an elaborate fundraising performance. No one stepped forward. No cameras rushed closer. There was only Ava, waiting patiently, as though she believed kindness could still exist without an audience. "Why me?" he asked almost in a whisper. Ava glanced around the enormous ballroom filled with sparkling gowns, tailored tuxedos, polished marble, and golden light before looking back into his eyes. "Because," she said softly, "everyone here keeps smiling at you." But nobody looked like they wondered whether you needed one. For the first time in many years, Jonathan Hayes forgot there were hundreds of people watching, forgot the speech waiting unfinished behind him, forgot the fortune that had made him one of the most recognizable men in America. All he could see was one little girl whose quiet question had reached a place inside him that success never had. Ava stood quietly beneath the warm glow of the ballroom lights, while Jonathan remained kneeling in front of her, unable to explain why his chest suddenly felt heavier than it had only moments before. Around them, whispers spread through the crowd like ripples across still water. Some guests smiled politely, believing they were witnessing another carefully planned charitable gesture. Others exchanged doubtful glances, convinced the little girl had somehow found a clever way to attract the attention of the most influential man in the room. Jonathan barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on Ava's calm expression. She was not asking for anything else. She had not stretched out her hand for money. She had not mentioned food, clothes, or a place to stay. She simply smiled as though the question she had asked had already been answered. After several long seconds, Jonathan slowly wrapped his arms around her. It was not a dramatic embrace. It was gentle, careful, almost uncertain, as though both of them understood that something much deeper than a greeting had just taken place. Ava rested her cheek lightly against his shoulder and closed her eyes for only a brief moment before stepping back with the same quiet grace she had shown from the beginning. Jonathan noticed something unexpected. The room felt different. The applause he normally received at charity events sounded distant compared to the silence that followed this simple moment. His assistant, Caroline Mitchell, approached carefully with his prepared speech still folded neatly in her hands. "Sir," she whispered, "everyone is waiting." Jonathan looked at the papers and then back at Ava. "They can wait another minute," he replied softly. Caroline nodded and stepped away without another word. Jonathan turned toward the little girl again. "Would you like to sit with me for dinner?" he asked. Ava tilted her head slightly, as though considering the invitation with great seriousness. "Only if I am not taking someone else's place," she answered. Jonathan felt an unexpected smile reach his face. "You are not taking anyone's place." Ava nodded. "Then thank you, sir." As they walked together across the ballroom, conversation stopped once again. Waiters carrying silver trays instinctively stepped aside. Guests who had spent months hoping for a few minutes of Jonathan's attention now watched him give his entire focus to a 7-year-old girl wearing worn sneakers and a faded cardigan. When they reached the table reserved for the evening's honored guests, Jonathan pulled out the chair beside his own. Ava hesitated before sitting. She carefully smoothed the wrinkles in her cardigan and quietly folded her hands in her lap. The elegant place setting in front of her sparkled beneath the crystal lights, yet she did not reach for anything. Jonathan noticed. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Ava smiled politely. "A little." "Then why did you not begin?" She looked around the room before answering. "Grandma always said you should wait until everyone at the table feels welcome." Jonathan looked across the crowded ballroom filled with successful executives, philanthropists, celebrities, and elected officials. For the first time in years, he realized that despite all the expensive decorations and generous donations, very few people in the room had truly made one another feel welcome. Ava quietly reached into the pocket of her cardigan and carefully adjusted the small blue and white woven bracelet around her wrist. Jonathan watched her fingers protect it with remarkable tenderness. He did not know why, but the sight of that worn little bracelet stirred a distant memory that remained just beyond his reach. Like a familiar song he could almost remember, but could not yet hear completely. Jonathan could not take his eyes off the small woven bracelet resting against Ava's wrist. The blue and white threads had faded with time, yet every knot had been carefully preserved, as though someone had repaired it again and again rather than replace it. There was something strangely familiar about its pattern. A memory lingered just beyond his reach, refusing to reveal itself completely. Before he could ask about it, a server gently placed warm rolls and soup in front of them. Ava waited patiently until everyone seated nearby had been served before quietly lifting her spoon. She ate slowly, never wasting a single bite. Jonathan noticed every movement. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who respected even the smallest blessing. After a few moments, he smiled. "You have very good manners." Ava looked up with a gentle smile. "Grandma used to say good manners cost nothing, but they make people feel rich." Jonathan lowered his eyes for a second. He had attended hundreds of expensive dinners where people spoke endlessly about generosity, yet he could not remember hearing wisdom delivered with such simple sincerity. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said softly. Ava carefully placed her spoon back into the bowl. Before answering, "Her name was Eleanor Brooks. She said every person carries something heavy that nobody else can see. That is why we should always be kind first." Jonathan felt those words settle heavily inside him. He had built companies by measuring profits, risks, and opportunities. Somehow, he had forgotten how to measure kindness. Ava continued, speaking with quiet warmth. "She knitted this bracelet for me when I was 5 years old. She told me blue was for hope and white was for peace. She said if I ever felt lonely, I should look at it and remember that somebody loved me before the world even knew my name." Jonathan looked at the bracelet once more. This time another image appeared in the corner of his memory. A small community center, folding chairs, the smell of fresh coffee, a cheerful older woman laughing while teaching children how to weave colorful bracelets from yarn donated by neighbors. He blinked. The picture vanished before he could grasp it completely. "Did your grandmother live here in New York?" he asked. Ava nodded. "Most of her life. She volunteered wherever people needed help. She always believed every stranger could become family if someone cared enough to listen." Jonathan slowly leaned back in his chair. A strange feeling spread through him. He had heard those words before. Years ago, long before he became one of the wealthiest men in the country. Caroline quietly approached the table again. "Sir, the board members are asking whether the keynote speech will continue." Jonathan looked toward the stage where the microphone still stood waiting beneath the bright lights. He surprised even himself with his answer. "Tell them tonight the speech can wait." Caroline smiled softly, understanding there would be no changing his mind. As she walked away, Jonathan turned back toward Ava. "What made you come here tonight?" Ava hesitated for the first time since they had met. Her fingers gently touched the bracelet again before she answered. "Grandma left me one letter before she passed away. She told me that if I ever met a man named Jonathan Hayes, I should not ask him for money. I should only remind him that the happiest day of his life had nothing to do with becoming rich." Jonathan felt the color leave his face. The sounds of the ballroom faded into the distance. Somewhere deep inside his memory, a forgotten door had begun to open, and for the first time in more than 20 years, he realized this little girl had not entered his life by accident. Jonathan remained silent for several long moments, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the dinner table while Ava's words echoed through his mind. The happiest day of his life had nothing to do with becoming rich. It sounded impossible, yet something inside him insisted it was true. He slowly looked at the little bracelet again, and another forgotten memory surfaced with greater clarity. He was 23 years old, exhausted, overwhelmed by debt, and uncertain whether his small technology startup would survive another month. One rainy Saturday afternoon, he had wandered into a neighborhood community center simply to escape the weather. An older woman with kind eyes had welcomed him without asking his name or what he could offer. She had handed him a warm bowl of vegetable soup, invited him to help children build simple craft projects, and smiled as though he belonged there all along. Jonathan remembered laughing freely that afternoon, laughing without worrying about investors, deadlines, or expectations. It had been one of the last times he had felt completely at peace. His heart beat a little faster as he looked back at Ava. "Your grandmother. Did she volunteer at the Maple Street Community Center?" Ava's eyes brightened with surprise. "Yes, that was her favorite place in the whole city. She always said people walked in carrying worries and walked out carrying hope." Jonathan slowly closed his eyes. The memory finally settled into place. Eleanor Brooks. He remembered her gentle voice, encouraging nervous children to believe in themselves. He remembered her teaching everyone to weave colorful bracelets because, as she often said, every thread became stronger when it was connected to another. Most of all, he remembered making her a promise before leaving that rainy afternoon. If life ever became kind to him, he would come back and help. Keep the center open. He had meant every word. Then success arrived faster than he ever imagined. One company became 3. One office became towers filled with employees. Interviews, flights, awards, and endless meetings slowly buried that promise beneath decades of achievement. Jonathan opened his eyes again, filled not with pride, but with quiet regret. "I never came back," he whispered, almost to himself. Ava nodded gently. There was no judgment in her expression, only understanding. "Grandma knew life would become busy for you." She never sounded disappointed. Jonathan looked at her in disbelief. She was not angry. Ava shook her head. She said people do not always break promises because they stop caring. Sometimes they simply forget who they used to be. Those words settled over Jonathan with a weight greater than any business loss he had ever experienced. Across the ballroom, guests continued talking quietly, unaware that the most important conversation of the evening was happening far away from the stage. Jonathan noticed the untouched speech still resting on the podium beneath the bright lights. It suddenly felt like a speech written for someone he no longer wanted to be. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a small leather notebook that traveled with him everywhere. For years it had been filled with investment ideas, meeting schedules, and financial projections. Tonight he turned to a blank page and wrote only 4 simple words. "Find Maple Street again." Ava watched him with a soft smile. Grandma said writing something down makes the heart remember what the mind almost lost. Jonathan carefully closed the notebook and looked at the little girl across from him. For the first time in more than 2 decades, he realized this evening had never been about a charity gala, a donation, or another public appearance. It was about a forgotten promise quietly finding its way home through the gentle voice of a 7-year-old girl who had arrived carrying nothing except a worn bracelet. a letter, and the courage to remind a billionaire who he had once hoped to become. After the final guests began leaving the ballroom, Jonathan surprised everyone by canceling the private meetings scheduled for the rest of the evening. Caroline quietly updated his calendar while he walked beside Ava toward the front entrance of the hotel. Outside, the cool night air carried the distant sounds of New York traffic, and the city lights reflected across the sidewalks after a brief evening rain. A black sedan waited at the curb, but Jonathan did not open the rear door immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava with quiet curiosity. "Would you let me take you home?" he asked. Ava smiled politely. "Yes, sir, but it is not a place most people expect." Jonathan answered with a gentle smile. "I think tonight has already become full of surprises." During the drive, Ava looked through the window with the excitement of someone who still found beauty in ordinary things. She pointed toward a family walking hand in hand beneath a street lamp. She admired the bright murals painted across brick buildings. She laughed softly when she saw a dog happily chasing pigeons through a small park. Jonathan noticed that she never once asked about the luxury car, his business, or the expensive buildings they passed. Instead, she asked him simple questions. "Do you ever watch the sunset without looking at your phone? When was the last time you ate dinner with someone who made you laugh? Do you know your neighbors?" Each question seemed surprisingly ordinary, yet Jonathan struggled to answer any of them honestly. Nearly 40 minutes later, the car entered an older neighborhood where modest apartment buildings stood beside small family-owned stores. Ava asked the driver to stop in front of a red brick building with flower boxes beneath several windows. The paint had faded with time, but every flower looked carefully watered. Jonathan stepped onto the sidewalk and followed Ava inside. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh bread and laundry soap. Children's drawings decorated one wall, each signed with colorful crayon names. Before Jonathan could ask anything, 3 younger children ran toward Ava with wide smiles. "You are back," one little boy exclaimed as she gently hugged each of them. "Did you have fun?" a little girl asked. Ava nodded. "I met someone Grandma wanted me to find." The children greeted Jonathan with cheerful manners before returning to a table where they were finishing homework together. An elderly neighbor looked up from the kitchen and smiled warmly. "You must be Mr. Hayes. Eleanor spoke about you many years ago." Jonathan looked around in amazement. The apartment was simple but filled with warmth. Shelves overflowed with library books. Family photographs covered the walls. A handwritten calendar listed birthdays, school events, and neighborhood volunteer projects. Nothing suggested wealth, yet everything reflected care. "Do all of these children live here?" Jonathan asked quietly. The neighbor smiled. "Some stay after school until their parents finish work. Some need a safe place for dinner." Eleanor believed no child should feel alone if there was room for one more chair. Ava walked toward a wooden cabinet and carefully removed a weathered scrapbook tied with a blue ribbon. She carried it to Jonathan with both hands, as though presenting something priceless. "Grandma told me not to open this until I found you." Jonathan accepted it gently. The cover was worn smooth from years of loving use. Tucked beneath the ribbon was a small handwritten note in Eleanor's familiar script. His hands trembled slightly before he unfolded the paper. The first sentence stopped him completely. It read, "If you are reading this, Jonathan, then the little girl standing beside you has already reminded you of the promise that mattered more than any fortune you would ever build." Jonathan carefully unfolded the letter, and for a moment the room around him seemed to disappear. Eleanor's handwriting was steady and graceful, every sentence carrying the same warmth he remembered from years before. "Dear Jonathan," the letter began, "if life has brought you here, then I know your heart is finally ready to remember what your success could never replace. You once promised to help this little community continue welcoming anyone who needed kindness more than judgment. I never reminded you because promises made from love should never be collected like debts. They should be rediscovered when the heart is ready." Jonathan slowly lowered the page, unable to speak. Ava sat quietly beside him, allowing the silence to do what words could not. The elderly neighbor poured 2 cups of warm chamomile tea and placed them gently on the table before stepping away to give them privacy. Jonathan turned another page inside the scrapbook. The first photographs showed children laughing around folding tables inside the old Maple Street Community Center. There was Eleanor helping them paint wooden birdhouses, teaching them how to weave colorful bracelets, and reading storybooks with a smile that seemed capable of making every child feel important. Then Jonathan found a photograph that made his breath catch. He was standing beside Eleanor more than 20 years earlier, holding a half-finished bracelet while smiling more naturally than he had in decades. On the back of the picture, Eleanor had written, "The richest people are often the ones still searching for home." Jonathan gently touched the faded ink with his fingertips. "I forgot this version of myself," he whispered. Ava looked at him kindly. "Grandma never forgot." She reached into the scrapbook and carefully removed a folded sheet of notebook paper covered with children's handwriting. "She wanted you to read this too." Jonathan unfolded it slowly. Across the page were dozens of short messages written by children who had visited the community center over many years. One thanked Eleanor for teaching him to believe he could become a firefighter. Another said she had learned that reading books could take her anywhere. One simply read, "Thank you for remembering my birthday when nobody else did." Jonathan realized that none of those children had written about toys, money, or expensive gifts. They remembered feeling seen, welcomed, and loved. Tears quietly filled his eyes. "She changed so many lives," he said softly. The elderly neighbor smiled from across the room. "She always believed kindness could travel farther than any check someone could write." Jonathan looked around the apartment once more. The children had finished their homework and were now laughing together while putting away books and crayons. Ava helped the youngest little boy tie his shoe before reminding him to brush his teeth. She did every small task with the same quiet patience Eleanor had once shown him. Suddenly Jonathan understood something that no financial report had ever taught him. Eleanor's greatest legacy had never been a building, a program, or even the community center itself. Her legacy lived inside people who continued choosing kindness every ordinary day. He carefully placed the letter back inside the scrapbook and looked at Ava with renewed determination. "Tomorrow morning," he said gently, "I would like you to show me Maple Street." Ava's smile grew brighter than it had all evening. "I was hoping you would say that." Jonathan nodded slowly as he looked once more at the blue and white bracelet around her wrist. For the first time in many years, tomorrow felt more important than every meeting already waiting on his calendar, because somewhere beyond the busy streets of New York stood a forgotten place where one promise had quietly waited for him to come home. The next morning the city awakened beneath a pale golden sunrise, and for the first time in years Jonathan Hayes instructed his driver to cancel every meeting on his calendar. Caroline called twice to confirm that investors from California had already arrived, but Jonathan answered with calm certainty. "Please thank them for their patience. Today I have somewhere more important to be." Less than an hour later, he stood beside Ava on the quiet sidewalk outside the old Maple Street Community Center. Time had left its mark on the brick building. The paint around the windows had faded. The wooden sign leaned slightly to one side, and several flower beds waited for fresh care, yet laughter drifted through an open window, just as it had more than 20 years before. Jonathan stood silently for several moments before stepping toward the entrance. His hand rested against the weathered doorframe, and memories returned one after another with remarkable clarity. He remembered carrying folding chairs into the activity room. He remembered helping children build birdhouses from small pieces of wood. He remembered Eleanor laughing, as everyone proudly showed their colorful bracelets to one another. Most of all, he remembered how light his heart had felt before success became something he believed he had to chase every single day. Ava gently pushed open the front door. Inside, little had changed. Shelves filled with donated books still lined one wall. Children's artwork covered colorful bulletin boards. The familiar smell of crayons, fresh coffee, and homemade cookies filled the air. Several volunteers looked up with surprise before warm smiles spread across their faces. One elderly gentleman slowly approached Jonathan and extended his hand. "You probably do not remember me," he said kindly. "I am Robert Collins. I helped Eleanor here every Saturday." Jonathan shook his hand warmly. "I remember your smile," he answered honestly. Robert laughed softly. "She always said people remember kindness much longer than names." Ava wandered toward a group of children working together on art projects. Within moments, she was kneeling beside them, helping a little girl finish a paper butterfly while encouraging a shy boy to add more bright colors to his drawing. Jonathan watched quietly from across the room. Nobody had asked Ava to take charge. She simply noticed where encouragement was needed and offered it naturally. Eleanor truly lived on through her. Robert invited Jonathan into a small office near the back of the building. On one wall hung framed photographs from decades of community events. Jonathan found himself in several of them, smiling beside children whose names he no longer knew. Robert opened a drawer and carefully placed an old notebook on the desk. Eleanor left this for our records, he explained. Whenever someone helped here, she wrote one sentence about what made them special. Jonathan slowly opened the notebook and searched until he found his own name. Beneath it, Eleanor had written, "Jonathan listens with his whole heart. I hope success never becomes louder than that voice." Jonathan closed his eyes as emotion quietly settled over him. Success had become louder. It had drowned out friendships, simple joys, and promises made with complete sincerity. But standing inside this familiar building, surrounded by ordinary people quietly changing lives without expecting recognition, he realized that voice had never disappeared completely. It had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to help him hear it again. When he walked back into the activity room, Ava looked up and smiled as though she already knew exactly what decision he had made, even before he spoke a single word. Jonathan walked slowly toward the center of the activity room, while the cheerful conversations around him continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The children kept drawing pictures, stacking books, and laughing over simple games. No one seemed impressed by his name or the companies he owned. Here, he was simply another adult standing in a room where kindness mattered more than accomplishments. Ava looked up from the table where she was helping a young boy finish a colorful paper airplane. She smiled with quiet confidence, the same peaceful expression she had carried from the moment they first met. Jonathan realized she had never tried to convince him to change. She had simply invited him to remember. He turned toward Robert Collins and the volunteers gathered nearby. "How many children come through these doors every year?" he asked. Robert smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Some stay for one afternoon. Others grow up here. Usually around 800 children and families receive help in one way or another each year. We have always managed because neighbors keep showing up for one another." Jonathan slowly looked around the building again. He noticed worn tables repaired more than once instead of replaced. Shelves built by volunteers. Hand-sewn curtains. Every corner reflected love instead of luxury. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed his notebook once more. This time he did not write a reminder. Instead, he quietly tore out the page and handed it to Caroline, who had just arrived after following his location. She looked down at the note with surprise. It contained only one sentence. "Restore Maple Street completely." She looked back at Jonathan. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. Jonathan smiled. "No publicity campaign. No press conference. No building named after me. Just make sure every child who walks through these doors feels what I felt here years ago." Caroline nodded without hesitation. "It will be done." Ava overheard only part of the conversation. She walked over and gently tugged on Jonathan's sleeve. "Can I ask you something else?" Jonathan knelt beside her with an easy smile. "You may ask me anything." Ava thought carefully before speaking. "When everything is finished, will you come back even when there are no cameras?" Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room at the volunteers serving snacks, the children helping one another clean paintbrushes, and the neighbors chatting like extended family. He understood what Ava was really asking. She was not asking about one generous donation. She was asking whether he would choose a different way of living. Jonathan nodded slowly. "I promise I will." Ava smiled, but she did not celebrate or clap. She simply believed him. That quiet trust meant more to Jonathan than any award he had ever accepted. Over the following weeks, construction crews carefully repaired the aging building without interrupting its daily programs. Local artists volunteered to paint bright murals. Libraries donated thousands of books. Businesses quietly contributed furniture, computers, and supplies after learning that the project would honor Eleanor Brooks instead of any wealthy sponsor. Neighbors who had not visited in years returned to volunteer on weekends. Parents baked cookies. Teenagers planted flowers. Retired teachers offered free tutoring after school. The kindness Eleanor had planted decades earlier seemed to bloom all at once. Standing beside Ava in the newly restored community garden one crisp Saturday morning, Jonathan realized that generosity could build walls and roofs, But only ordinary people choosing one another every day could truly build a home. And he silently thanked the little girl whose gentle courage had led him back to the place where his heart had been waiting all along. Nearly 1 year later, the Maple Street Community Center welcomed families through bright blue doors that seemed to carry hope as naturally as sunlight. Fresh flowers lined the entrance, colorful murals filled every hallway, and the laughter of children echoed through rooms that had once struggled simply to stay open. Yet the greatest change could not be painted on a wall or measured in dollars. It lived in the people who returned week after week because they had discovered that kindness grows stronger when it is shared. Jonathan Hayes no longer arrived surrounded by assistants or carefully planned schedules. On Saturday mornings, he usually carried boxes of donated books, helped repair broken shelves, or sat on the floor reading stories to children who eagerly gathered around him. Many of the younger children never knew he was one of the wealthiest men in America. To them, he was simply Mr. Jonathan, the tall man who always remembered their names and never hurried through a conversation. Ava often watched him from across the room with a quiet smile. She noticed the small changes that others missed. He laughed more easily. He left his phone in his coat pocket for hours at a time. He listened without glancing toward the clock. One peaceful afternoon, after a neighborhood celebration honoring Eleanor Brooks, Jonathan and Ava sat together beneath the old oak tree growing beside the community garden. The blue and white bracelet still rested around Ava's wrist, faded a little more by time, but just as carefully protected. Jonathan looked toward the children playing nearby before speaking softly. "There is something I have wanted to ask you since the night we met." Ava turned toward him with gentle curiosity. "What is it?" Jonathan smiled. "Why did you really ask me for a hug? Out of everyone in that ballroom, why did you choose me?" Ava looked down for a moment, gently tracing one of the woven threads around her bracelet. Then she lifted her eyes and answered with the same calm honesty that had first stopped him in his tracks. "Because Grandma always said people who spend their lives taking care of everyone else sometimes forget someone should care about them too." Jonathan listened quietly. Ava continued with a soft smile. "When I saw you standing on that stage, everyone was applauding you. Everyone admired you. But you looked lonelier than anyone else in the room." Jonathan felt emotion rise quietly inside him. Before he could respond, Ava added the words that Eleanor had somehow planted in her heart long before this moment. "I did not ask because I needed a hug. I asked because I thought you needed one." Jonathan lowered his head as tears filled his eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. In that single sentence, every missing piece of the past finally came together. He had believed he was rescuing an old promise, restoring a forgotten building, and honoring a remarkable woman. The truth was far simpler and far more beautiful. A little girl carrying nothing more than courage, kindness, and a worn bracelet had rescued something money could never buy. She had given him back the part of himself he had almost lost forever. Jonathan gently opened his arms once more, and Ava smiled before giving him another warm hug beneath the shade of the old oak tree. This time there were no crystal chandeliers, no distinguished guests, and no cameras waiting to capture the moment. There was only the quiet certainty that one small act of compassion had traveled farther than wealth ever could, proving that sometimes the greatest gift a child can offer is not asking the world to change for them, but reminding one heart how to change the world.